Welcome to the deep dive. Look, we know you are preparing for a pretty rigorous professional exam right now.
Yeah, balancing your daily workload with intense study sessions is a massive challenge.
It really is. So today, we're looking specifically at a dense but incredibly important document that you need to master for your test. It's the Canadian Institute of Planners, or CIP, Policy on Planning Practice and Reconciliation.
And we've gone through this material thoroughly so you don't have to parse every single page alone.
Exactly. We are going to follow the exact structural flow of the source document so your mental map perfectly aligns with what you'll see on test day.
To give you the immediate context you need, this policy was ratified by the CIP Board of Directors in December of 2018, and it applies to the Institute's more than 7,000 members across Canada.
Right, and it's also important to note how it was created because that context matters.
It does. The document was developed over 18 months by the Indigenous Community Planning Committee. They conducted extensive engagement through individual interviews, focus groups, and surveys with Indigenous planning practitioners and community leaders.
Which gives it a lot of weight.
Definitely. But before we get into the details, I need to make a brief note regarding my role in this discussion today.
Go for it.
Because this document fundamentally deals with historical discrimination, the legacy of residential schools, and various governmental policies, it touches on highly sensitive and deeply significant topics. My role today is strictly to impartially report the contents of the CIP document to help you pass your exam. I am not here to take political sides or to endorse specific viewpoints. I'm just here to lay out exactly what the text says so you have the factual grounding you need.
Okay, let's unpack this document, starting with how it sets the stage regarding policy context and Indigenous planning approaches.
Sounds good.
Because when you hear the word reconciliation in a corporate or governmental context, it can sometimes sound like a buzzword or, a final destination. How does this specific document define reconciliation for a practicing planner?
For your exam, do not think of reconciliation as a specific end goal. It is not a simple checkbox you can just mark off at the end of a project.
Right.
The text defines it as a commitment to establish and maintain a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It's an ongoing, long-term learning and healing process.
And the document emphasizes that the planning profession has a unique responsibility here, right?
Yeah.
Because planners directly influence how land is managed. They help formulate a community's vision for the future, and they play a key role in public education.
Exactly. That civic engagement piece is huge.
The text also makes a vital historical point that really frames everything else. It notes that planning has been happening in the land currently known as Canada since time immemorial. But it explicitly states that Canadian society hasn't historically honored those systems. So if these traditional systems haven't been upheld by the mainstream profession, how does the document actually define what Indigenous planning looks like on the ground?
Well, what's fascinating here is the acknowledgement that Indigenous planning is not a monolith. But the document does list a few core common elements you should know.
Let's hear them.
First, it is community-driven and inclusive, meaning it deliberately incorporates the voices of youth, elders, women, and men. Second, it empowers community members by focusing on individual and community strengths rather than just deficits.
That's a great shift in perspective.
It is. Third, it fundamentally requires time. This is a crucial distinction from traditional Western planning, which is often driven by rigid municipal deadlines.
Yeah, municipal timelines don't usually leave much room for storytelling.
Right. But Indigenous planning requires the necessary time to hear and understand the experiences and emotions embodied in people's stories. Fourth, it actively utilizes traditional knowledge to shape decisions. And finally, it prioritizes long-term land stewardship and responsible development.
To understand how all of this fits into the broader national context, the document points to two major frameworks. The first is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, and its 94 calls to action.
Which is foundational.
Absolutely. Because even if those calls to action don't explicitly use the word planning, they deal directly with land, economy, culture, health, law, and governance. Those are the exact arenas planners operate in every single day.
Yeah, you can't separate planning from those calls to action.
And the second framework the document leans on is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, commonly known as UNDRAP, which the Government of Canada endorsed in 2016.
UNDRAP is critical because it provides international guidance on cooperative relationships based on equality, partnership, good faith, and mutual respect. The TRC specifically called for all levels of government to fully adopt and implement UNDRAP.
So for a planner, understanding these two frameworks is essentially the baseline for stepping into any community engagement process.
100%.
Understanding those indigenous planning approaches naturally leads to the legal reality of how those approaches intersect with Canadian law. Here's where it gets really interesting, especially for your exam prep, because you need to distinguish between different types of rights.
Yes, the document breaks these down very clearly.
Right, so first we have Aboriginal rights, which the text notes are codified in the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982, specifically Section 35.
Then there are inherent rights. The document defines these as collective, inalienable rights that flow from the continued use and occupation of certain areas by Indigenous peoples. Crucially, this includes the right to self-determination.
Okay, got it.
And third, there are treaty rights. These flow from specific, negotiated agreements or treaties made between Indigenous nations and the Crown or Canada.
I want to pause on a distinction that is almost guaranteed to show up on your exam. The document separates Aboriginal law from Indigenous law.
Yes.
To a layperson, those might sound like synonyms, but they represent entirely different paradigms.
That is a prime exam topic right there. Aboriginal law specifically refers to the body of Canadian law concerning Indigenous people in Canada. It's the legal framework created by the Canadian courts and legislatures, largely interpreting that Section 35 of the Constitution Act we just mentioned.
Okay, and Indigenous law.
Indigenous law, on the other hand, refers to the actual legal traditions, customs, and practices of the Indigenous peoples themselves. These are the internal, community-specific systems that guide their own decision-making and stewardship.
So, to put that in a practical scenario,
Yeah.
if a province wants to approve a new resource extraction project, Aboriginal law is what dictates the government's legal obligation to consult the local First Nation.
Right.
But Indigenous law encompasses the traditional protocols that the First Nation uses internally to determine who has the authority to speak for that specific tract of land and whether the project aligns with their traditional stewardship principles.
That is the exact distinction. And bridging the gap between those two legal realities requires what the TRC calls truth-telling.
Which means acknowledging the past.
Exactly. The document states that for justice and healing to occur, the planning profession in Canada must acknowledge the detrimental impact that past discriminatory planning practices have had, acknowledging that historical truth is positioned as a mandatory prerequisite to building honest and constructive future relationships.
Which brings us to the overarching policy goal of the CIP. The entire purpose of this document is to envision a future where reconciliation is meaningfully embedded in planning practice, built on mutual respect, trust, and dialogue.
Right, but a broad goal needs actionable steps.
It does. The text outlines 8 specific objectives to get there. Instead of just listing them sequentially, let's look at how they conceptually group together, starting with how a planner aligns with broad, legal, and human rights frameworks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the first few objectives focus heavily on foundational alignment. Objective 1 states that planning must be based on a respect for the well-being of all people and the natural environment, recognizing that the two are intricately linked.
Which makes sense given the focus on land stewardship.
Yeah. Objective 2 requires planners to actively support the realization of the TRC calls to action and the implementation of UNDRI principles in their daily work. And Objective 3 requires planners to thoroughly understand the jurisdictional and legal context of planning as it relates to treaties and the rights of Indigenous peoples.
This means a planner cannot claim ignorance of the legal landscape.
Yeah.
It's a professional obligation to know it.
Exactly.
The next theme in these objectives shifts from legal frameworks to actual co-creation and recognizing Indigenous systems. So, Objective 4 challenges planners to advocate for and work to co-create meaningful planning processes.
And this isn't just municipal governments doing something for or to Indigenous communities.
Right. It's about doing it with them alongside municipalities, regions, provinces, and territories. Objective 5 reinforces this by stating planners must recognize and uphold Indigenous planning approaches, law, and governance systems as valid and operational.
The final cluster of objectives focuses on advocacy and the growth of the profession itself. Objective 6 says planners must advocate for planning policy and legislation that ensures the rights, knowledge, protocols, and planning methods of Indigenous peoples are respected.
And Objective 7 focuses on internal representation.
Yes, supporting enhanced opportunities for Indigenous people to enter the planning profession and celebrating the unique skills they bring. Finally, Objective 8 reminds planners to respect the diversity of Indigenous peoples across Canada and their self-determined planning processes. There is no single, monolithic Indigenous culture, and planning practices must reflect that diversity. So, what does this all mean for you, the individual planner, when you're actually on the ground? The document moves from these high-level objectives into the highly practical role of the planner, breaking it down into three areas: enhancing professional practice, engaging communities, and mutual capacity building. Let's look at professional practice first.
Sure.
The text insists that planners need to actively educate themselves on historical contexts. You cannot effectively plan a community's future if you don't understand the historical lack of Indigenous participation in public policy, the devastating legacy of residential schools, and the intergenerational impacts these policies have had. Enhancing your practice also means understanding the specific Indigenous context and history of the region you currently work in. It means staying updated on federal and provincial legal rulings. And crucially, it means understanding your role in the government's duty to consult.
Let's define that for the exam.
The duty to consult and accommodate primarily refers to the Crown's duty when it's considering actions that might adversely affect Aboriginal or treaty rights guaranteed by Section 35.
But the planner isn't the Crown.
Right. While the ultimate legal duty cannot be delegated away by the government, the document notes that planners often handle the procedural aspects. By engaging communities early in the development of planning tools, planners play a massive role in fulfilling the spirit of that duty.
That leads directly into the second practical area: engaging Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations. The document explicitly calls for a nothing about us without us approach.
Also referred to as a don't start without approach.
Yeah, this flips the traditional top-down planning model completely on its head. It means engaging communities before any activity that affects them or their rights even begins.
And that engagement requires incredible nuance. Planners must respect existing governance systems. You need to understand the differences between elected leadership, like a band council, and hereditary or traditional governance where they exist.
You have to take direction from Indigenous community leaders on how and with whom engagement should happen.
Exactly.
You aren't marching in with a preset municipal agenda. In fact, the policy clearly states that planners should offer their planning knowledge only where it can complement Indigenous processes to meet the community's own aspirations.
The document also addresses the complexities of urban planning. If you are doing urban planning, you have to engage the host community whose traditional territory the urban area rests upon.
But you also need to engage the diverse other urban Indigenous groups living within that city.
Yes. And throughout all of this, the text reminds us that community-driven planning can play a huge role in community healing. But healing requires additional time. Planners must build that flexibility into their project schedules.
Which flows perfectly into the third area of a planner's role: participating in mutual capacity building. We just talked about the need for time, and the reality on the ground is that many Indigenous communities are administratively overburdened.
Very much so.
They're receiving constant requests for engagement from various levels of government and private developers.
Because of that administrative burden, a community might not be able to respond to a planner's request within a rigid, predetermined municipal timeframe.
Right.
The document states planners must remain flexible to ensure sufficient space is created for respectful relationships. But capacity building isn't just about accommodating schedules, it's mutual. Planners aren't just going into communities to offer their Western technical skills.
No, planners must view these interactions as an opportunity to learn. Traditional practices represent millennia of community and ecological stewardship. Planners are learning from the original experts in sustainability.
That's a great way to look at it.
To make that mutual capacity building actually work, the document relies heavily on two specific concepts you need to understand for your exam: cultural safety and cultural humility. These dictate how a planner should conduct themselves.
Let's treat this like a rapid-fire flashcard review for a minute.
Perfect. Let's look at cultural safety first. This is defined as an outcome based on respectful engagement. It recognizes and strives to address power differentials that exist in planning systems.
For example, the inherent power imbalance between a government decision maker and a marginalized community member.
Right. The goal is that all people feel respected and physically and emotionally safe when participating in planning processes.
Now, if cultural safety is the outcome you want for the community, cultural humility is the internal work the planner must do to get there.
The personal reflection part.
Exactly. The document defines cultural humility as a practice of self-reflection. It is about understanding your own personal and systemic biases to develop mutual trust. It involves humbly acknowledging yourself as a learner when it comes to understanding someone else's experience. You cannot create a culturally safe environment without first practicing cultural humility.
Okay, let's also clarify a couple of other key terms the document uses to ensure your definitions are locked in. Throughout the text, it uses the term indigenous peoples. For the context of this policy, this refers collectively to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada.
However, the text explicitly notes that different indigenous peoples and nations often use their own specific terms to self-identify, which planners should always respect and utilize.
And what about indigenous planning?
When the document refers to Indigenous planning, it uses this as a generic, inclusive term to cover the vast diversity of planning that happens at all scales, undertaken either with or by Indigenous communities, nations, and individuals.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the individual planner's responsibilities, but what is the CIP itself actually doing to support all this? The final section of the document serves as a call to action and outlines the role of the CIP.
The core message is that reconciliation is more than just a conversation. It entails careful, sustained action at an institutional level.
This raises an important question about institutional accountability. If you face a multiple-choice question about what the CIP is formally committed to doing, you need to know these specific points.
The CIP promises to promote reconciliation in its communications, advocacy, and educational standards. They promise to ensure practicing planners have access to the resources and training they need to actually implement these objectives.
They are also integrating Indigenous history, rights, issues, and culture into the Institute's continuous professional learning program.
Furthermore, they are pushing for this knowledge to become a core competency for the accreditation of university planning schools across the country.
They want to ensure the next generation of planners starts with this foundation.
Lastly, they commit to conducting an annual environmental scan and a membership survey to continually assess their progress and set new implementation priorities.
And that comprehensive structure is exactly what you need to understand to conquer this material. Let's briefly retrace the path we've taken through the document to solidify your mental map.
Good idea. We started with the context understanding reconciliation as a long-term healing relationship and acknowledging Indigenous planning practices that have existed since time immemorial.
We connected that to the frameworks of the TRC and UNDRIP. We explored the vital legal distinctions, specifically the difference between Canadian Aboriginal law and traditional Indigenous law, as well as the various types of rights.
From there, we walked through the overarching policy goal and the 8 specific objectives, which range from respecting human rights and the environment to advocating for co-created processes and better professional representation.
We broke down your future role as a planner into 3 practical areas: enhancing your practice through historical and legal education, engaging communities with a nothing about us without us mindset, and building mutual capacity by embracing cultural humility to create cultural safety.
And finally, we reviewed the CIP's institutional commitments to sustained action.
You have the structural knowledge you need, and you understand how these concepts apply practically on the ground.
You really do. And as you wrap up this study session, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder off air that builds on the text we've reviewed. If Indigenous planning practices reflect millennia of successful, sustainable land stewardship and community well-being, how might truly embedding these ancient practices fundamentally redefine what we consider to be modern and innovative urban planning today?
That is an incredible question to think about as you move forward in your career. To our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Preparing for a professional exam is a demanding journey, but by mastering the nuances of policies like this one, you aren't just memorizing facts for a test. You're equipping yourself to be a better, more thoughtful planner. Best of luck on your exam. You've put in the hard work, and we know you are going to do great. We'll catch you next time.